Arrogant young millionaire sees homeless twins begging for food, and his response shocks everyone. Marcus Wellington, a 32-year-old young millionaire known for his arrogance and cold demeanor, has his life completely transformed when he encounters two 8-year-old twin girls begging for food in the rain. His first reaction shocks everyone around him. Not only does he ignore the girls, but he does something even more disturbing. However, a devastating discovery about the twins' past awakens buried memories he has tried to forget for decades. As the truth unfolds, Marcus realizes an impossible connection between himself and the girls that will change everything. The revelation of who the twins' parents are and how Marcus is tied to their fate will spark a twist no one could have imagined. What began as a casual encounter turns into a journey of redemption that will test the limits of forgiveness and second chances. In the end, the most shocking discovery is not about the twins. It is about Marcus himself and a family secret that has been kept for 3 decades. Marcus Wellington adjusted his platinum Rolex as he stepped out of his black Mercedes-AMG GT63S, the engine's purr still echoing in the underground garage of Wellington Tower. At 32, he commanded a real estate empire worth $800 million, built from the foundation his father had left him and expanded through ruthless ambition and calculated risks that would make most investors lose sleep. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished marble floor as he strode through the lobby of his headquarters, past employees who straightened their backs and avoided direct eye contact. Marcus thrived on this atmosphere of controlled fear and respect. Power, he had learned early in life, was not given. It was taken and maintained through unwavering dominance. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington." Rebecca, his executive assistant, appeared at his side with military precision. "Your 10 o'clock with the Japanese investors has been moved to 11:30. The City Planning Committee meeting is confirmed for 3, and your dinner reservation at Le Bernardin is secured for 8. Marcus nodded curtly, his steel-grey eyes focused on the elevator doors that opened the moment he approached them. Everything in his world moved according to his schedule, bent to his will. This morning would be no different, or so he believed. The 42nd floor housed his executive office, a testament to minimalist luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Central Park. Marcus loosened his silk Hermes tie and settled behind his mahogany desk, a piece that had cost more than most people's annual salary. He had 3 major deals to close before noon, each one capable of generating millions in profit. But first he needed his usual breakfast from Delacroix Café, a quaint establishment 6 blocks away that served the only coffee he deemed acceptable. It was a ritual that grounded his morning routine, a small indulgence in his precisely ordered existence. The October air bit sharply as Marcus emerged onto Fifth Avenue, his charcoal wool overcoat protecting him from the morning chill. The city buzzed with its usual energy, taxi horns, construction noise, the endless stream of people hurrying to their destinations. He walked with purpose, his presence parting crowds, like a ship cutting through water. Delacroix Café occupied a corner spot, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk through large windows. Marcus had discovered this place 3 years ago, when his usual delivery service had failed him during a crucial merger negotiation. The owner, Henri Delacroix, made coffee that reminded Marcus of the European trips he had taken as a child with his parents before everything changed. "The usual, Mr. Wellington?" Henry asked with his slight French accent, already reaching for the premium Ethiopian beans. "Double shot, no sugar," Marcus confirmed, checking his phone for urgent messages. His investment team had identified a promising property development opportunity in Brooklyn, something that could net him $50 million if executed properly. As Henry prepared his coffee with artisanal precision, Marcus noticed the rain beginning to fall outside. Light droplets at first, then steadily increasing to a proper autumn downpour. He grimaced, knowing this would complicate his walk back to the office and potentially delay his schedule. "Nasty weather today," Henry observed, following Marcus's gaze toward the window. "Good thing you have somewhere warm to go." Marcus accepted his coffee, the aromatic steam rising from the perfectly crafted cup. "Weather is just another variable to manage," he replied. his tone suggesting that nature itself should bend to his convenience. As he turned toward the door, preparing to brave the rain, Marcus stopped short. Through the cafe's rain-streaked window, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Two small figures huddled against the brick wall of the building across the street, their thin clothes soaked through, their dark hair plastered to their heads. Twin girls, couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old, sat with their backs pressed against the cold stone, sharing a piece of cardboard that provided minimal protection from the rain. Their clothes, a tattered pink sweater and faded jeans on one, a torn blue jacket on the other, hung loose on their small frames, suggesting they had lost weight recently. One of the girls, the one in the pink sweater, held up a small handwritten sign that was disintegrating in the rain. Marcus could barely make out the words, "Please help us eat." The sight triggered something deep in Marcus's memory, a flash of his own childhood that he had spent years burying. For a moment, he was 7 years old again, standing in the rain outside his family's estate after the lawyers had come, after everything had been taken away, after his parents had... "Sir, your coffee?" Henri's voice snapped Marcus back to the present. Marcus realized he had been standing frozen for several seconds, his hand gripping the door handle so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The two girls continued to sit in the rain, occasionally looking up at passing pedestrians with hope that was quickly replaced by disappointment. "Those children," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain against glass. "How long have they been there?" Henri moved to stand beside him, following his gaze. "The little ones? They appeared yesterday morning. Poor things. They don't speak much English. I think they said something about looking for their aunt, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "In this neighborhood, people don't stop for such things." Marcus watched as a businessman in an expensive suit walked past the girls without even glancing down. Then a woman in designer clothes, talking loudly on her phone, stepped around them as if they were invisible obstacles. The pattern repeated itself, person after person, each one choosing to look away, to pretend the children didn't exist. The girl in the blue jacket started coughing, a harsh sound that carried across the street despite the rain. Her sister wrapped an arm around her, trying to share what little warmth they could generate together. They looked so small, so helpless, so utterly abandoned by the world rushing past them. Marcus felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had spent years learning to suppress. It was dangerous, this feeling. It made people weak, made them vulnerable to exploitation. His father had taught him that lesson well before his death. Compassion was a luxury that successful men couldn't afford. But as he watched the twins huddled together against the storm, Marcus found himself remembering another lesson, one his mother had whispered to him in her final days. "Strength without mercy is just cruelty, my darling. Never forget that you have the power to choose who you become." The cafe door chimed as Marcus pushed it open, stepping into the rain without bothering to raise his umbrella. The cold water immediately began soaking through his overcoat, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the two small figures across the street, on the decision that would define not just this moment, but possibly the rest of his life. As Marcus Wellington crossed the street toward the homeless twins, the rain falling harder with each step, neither he nor anyone watching could have predicted that this encounter would unravel secrets buried for 30 years and force him to confront the truth about who he really was. The rain drummed against the pavement as Marcus approached the two girls, each step feeling heavier than the last. Up close, their condition was even more heartbreaking than he had realized from the cafe window. Their lips had a slight blue tinge from the cold, and their clothes were not just wet but filthy, suggesting they had been on the streets for more than just a day or two. The girl in the pink sweater looked up first, her large brown eyes meeting Marcus's with a mixture of hope and wariness. She couldn't have been more than 8, with delicate features that reminded him uncomfortably of someone from his past. Her twin sister, wearing the torn blue jacket, kept her head down, the coughing continuing in harsh, rasping bursts. "Please, mister," the first girl said in accented English, her voice barely audible over the rain. "My sister is sick. We just need food." Marcus stared down at them, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins or investment returns. These children were alone, vulnerable, and clearly in desperate need of help. Every instinct he had developed as a businessman told him to walk away, to not get involved in problems that weren't his to solve. But something else stirred within him, something that felt like an echo from a different life. "What are your names?" Marcus asked, crouching down to their level despite the rain soaking through his expensive pants. "I am Emma," the girl in pink replied, then gestured to her sister. "This is Sophie. We are looking for our Aunt Maria, but we cannot find her address. The paper with her information got wet and—" She held up the soggy remains of what had once been a piece of paper with writing on it. Marcus felt his chest tighten. These children were lost, not just homeless. They had come looking for family and found themselves stranded in one of the most expensive cities in the world, with no money, no food, and apparently no one willing to help them. "Where are you from originally?" he asked gently. "Guatemala," Emma replied. "Our mama sent us here after she got very sick. She said Aunt Maria would take care of us, but when we got to the address there was no one there. The neighbors said she moved months ago." Sophie's coughing intensified, and Marcus could see she was shivering violently despite her sister's attempts to keep her warm. They needed immediate medical attention and shelter, not conversation in the rain. Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. "Come with me," he said, standing and extending his hand to Emma. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry." Emma looked up at him with suspicion that seemed far too mature for her young face. "Why would you help us?" "Everyone else just walks away." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Why was he helping them? He had walked past homeless people countless times without a second thought, had built his entire philosophy around the idea that everyone was responsible for their own fate. But looking at these two children, he couldn't summon the cold detachment that had served him so well in business. "Because," Marcus said, the words coming from a place he didn't fully understand, "sometimes people deserve a second chance." He pulled out his phone and dialed his driver. "James, bring the car to 5th and 62nd. "I need you to take us to Mount Sinai Hospital immediately." Emma's eyes widened. "Hospital? We cannot pay for hospital." "Don't worry about payment," Marcus replied, surprised by his own words. "Let's just make sure Sophie is okay first." As they waited for the car, Marcus found himself studying the girls more closely. Despite their current condition, there was something refined about their features, something that suggested they hadn't been born into poverty. Emma carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded him of his mother, while Sophie, even in her illness, had an ethereal quality that seemed almost familiar. The Mercedes pulled up, and James jumped out to open the rear door, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious surprise at seeing his employer with two bedraggled children. Marcus helped both girls into the car, noting how Emma protectively kept an arm around her sister. "Mount Sinai emergency," Marcus instructed as he settled into the seat across from them. During the drive, Emma told him more of their story. Their mother, Isabella, had been a teacher in Guatemala City before becoming ill with what the doctors there couldn't properly diagnose or treat. Desperate to ensure her daughter's safety and future, she had spent her last savings to send them to New York to find their Aunt Maria, who had promised years ago to care for the girls if anything happened to Isabella. "Mama gave us this," Emma said, pulling a small water-damaged envelope from her pocket. "She said it was important, that Aunt Maria would understand when she saw it." Marcus took the envelope carefully. It was addressed to Maria Gonzalez in elegant handwriting, but the address was smudged beyond recognition. Inside, he could feel what seemed to be a photograph and possibly some documents, but he resisted the urge to examine them without permission. At the hospital, Marcus found himself in the unusual position of using his influence for someone else's benefit. Within minutes of his arrival, Sophie was being examined by Dr. Rachel Stevens, one of the hospital's top pediatricians. Marcus had donated significantly to Mount Sinai's children's wing over the years, and his presence ensured immediate, top-quality care. "She has early-stage pneumonia," Dr. Stevens informed them after the examination. "Nothing that can't be treated with antibiotics and rest, but she needs to stay somewhere warm and dry for the next week while she recovers." Marcus nodded, then realized the weight of what he was committing to. These children had nowhere to go, no family they could locate, and now medical needs that required stability and care. "Doctor," Marcus said quietly, pulling Dr. Stevens aside, If I were to ensure they had proper accommodations during the recovery period, what would you recommend? Dr. Stevens looked at him curiously. Are you family? No, Marcus admitted. I found them on the street and I want to help. That's very kind of you, Mr. Wellington. Sophie needs a quiet environment, nutritious food, and someone to monitor her medication schedule. Emma appears healthy but malnourished. Both girls need stability and care while we figure out their long-term situation. As they spoke, Marcus became aware of Emma standing nearby, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something in her expression, a recognition that he couldn't quite understand. Mister, Emma said softly, approaching him, you have kind eyes like my papa did. Marcus felt his breath catch. Your father isn't with you. Emma shook her head sadly. Papa died when we were very small. Mama said he was a good man who would have loved us very much. She showed us his picture sometimes, but it got lost when our house flooded last year. Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. He found himself studying Emma's face more intently, looking for features that might explain the strange sense of familiarity he felt when looking at her. What was your father's name? He asked, though he wasn't sure why the question seemed so important. Carlos, Emma replied. Carlos Esteban. Mama said he had to go away before we were born, but that he left her this envelope for us. She held up the water-damaged letter again. Marcus's world tilted slightly. Carlos Esteban. The name echoed in his memory like a ghost from his past, connected to a time and place he had tried to forget. But it couldn't be the same person. It was impossible. Emma, Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled, did your mother ever mention anything else about your father? Where he was from or what he did for work? Emma thought for a moment. She said he was from a rich family in America, but that something terrible happened and he had to leave. She said he was kind and smart, and that he loved her very much, but that powerful people made it impossible for them to be together. The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Rich family in America. Something terrible happened. Powerful people making it impossible for them to be together. Each phrase triggered memories he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself they were dreams. Carlos Esteban hadn't been just anyone. He had been Marcus's older brother. As the realization crashed over him, Marcus understood that finding these girls in the rain hadn't been a coincidence. It was the universe finally demanding payment for a debt he had tried to ignore for 30 years. Emma and Sophie weren't just homeless children he had encountered by chance. They were his nieces. And if they were Carlos's daughters, then everything Marcus thought he knew about his brother's death, about his family's past, and about his own carefully constructed life, was about to be destroyed. Marcus excused himself from the hospital room, his legs unsteady as he walked toward the restroom. Once inside, he gripped the sink with both hands, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was pale, his usually perfectly styled hair disheveled from the rain, his grey eyes wide with shock. Carlos Esteban. His brother had used their mother's maiden name after the family scandal, after everything had fallen apart. Marcus remembered now. Carlos fleeing the country at 19, disappearing into South America while Marcus, then only 12, had been left to rebuild the Wellington name and fortune from the ashes of their father's mistakes. The memories came flooding back like a broken dam. Their father, Richard Wellington, had been involved in a massive financial scandal involving the theft of pension funds from construction workers. When the FBI investigation closed in, Richard had suffered a heart attack, dying before he could face trial. Their mother, Elena Esteban Wellington, had died of grief 6 months later, leaving 12-year-old Marcus to be raised by his grandfather, while Carlos, racked with guilt by association, had vanished to spare the family further shame. Marcus had spent the next 20 years not just rebuilding the Wellington fortune, but actively trying to forget he had ever had a brother. It had been easier to pretend Carlos had never existed than to deal with the pain of his abandonment. But now Carlos's daughters were here, and everything Marcus had buried was clawing its way back to the surface. He splashed cold water on his face and returned to the hospital room, where Emma was sitting beside Sophie's bed, holding her twin's hand while Sophie slept. Doctor. Stevens had started an IV with antibiotics, and Sophie's breathing was already less labored. "Mr. Wellington," Dr. Stevens approached him quietly, "I've been thinking about the girls' situation. If you're serious about helping them temporarily, I have some contacts at Child Services who might be able to expedite emergency placement." "No," Marcus interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "I mean, that won't be necessary. I'll take responsibility for them until we can locate their aunt." Dr. Stevens raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a commitment for someone who just met them. Are you sure you understand what you're taking on?" Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching him with those familiar brown eyes. Their mother's eyes, he realized now. "I'm sure." What he didn't tell Dr. Stevens was that taking care of Carlos's daughters wasn't generosity. It was penance for 30 years of willful blindness to his brother's fate. 2 hours later, after endless paperwork and several phone calls to expedite the process, Marcus found himself in the back of his Mercedes with 2 children who didn't know they were his family. Sophie was still groggy from the medication but breathing much easier. Emma sat rigidly upright, clearly overwhelmed by the turn their day had taken. "Where are we going?" Emma asked as the car pulled away from the hospital. Marcus had been asking himself the same question. His penthouse apartment was not equipped for children, and he had no experience whatsoever with caring for anyone other than himself. But something deeper than logic was driving his decisions now. "My home," he replied. "You'll stay there while Sophie recovers and while I help you find your Aunt Maria." Emma studied his face carefully. "Why are you really helping us? And don't say it's because people deserve second chances. Rich men like you don't help poor children unless they have a reason." The girl's perceptiveness was unsettling. At 8 years old, she already understood how the world worked better than most adults. "You're right," Marcus said slowly. "I do have a reason, but it's complicated and I'm not ready to explain it yet." Emma nodded as if this answer satisfied her more than false altruism would have. That's honest, at least. Marcus's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of Wellington Tower, accessible only by private elevator with biometric security. As they ascended, Marcus realized he was bringing children into a space that had been designed as a fortress against human connection. The minimalist decor, the sharp angles, the complete absence of anything warm or welcoming. It was a monument to his isolation. "Wow," Emma breathed as they entered the main living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline beyond. "It's like a castle in the sky." Sophie, leaning heavily on her sister, looked around with wide eyes. "Are you a king?" she whispered to Marcus. "Something like that," Marcus replied, then immediately felt foolish for playing along with a child's fantasy. He showed them to the guest suite on the 2nd floor of the penthouse, a space that hadn't been used in years. The room had its own bathroom and sitting area, decorated in neutral tones that suddenly seemed cold and unwelcoming. "The housekeeper comes in the mornings," Marcus explained. "Her name is Mrs. Chen, and she'll help you with anything you need. There's a phone here that connects directly to my office if you need me during the day." Emma was examining everything with careful attention, as if memorizing details. "Will we meet your family?" "I don't have family," Marcus said automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, I live alone." "Everyone has family somewhere," Emma said quietly, "even if they're far away or can't be together." Her words hit him like an accusation. Marcus had family right here in his home, and they didn't even know it. The weight of the secret felt like it might crush him. That evening, after Mrs. Chen had brought dinner and Sophie had taken her medication, Marcus found himself sitting in his study, staring at the water-damaged envelope Emma had given him. She had insisted he keep it safe while they settled in, trusting him with what might be their only connection to their missing aunt. His hands shook slightly as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a letter, both partially damaged by water but still legible. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and familiar brown eyes, Isabella, the girl's mother. She was standing next to a tall man with Marcus's same grey eyes and strong jawline. Carlos. But this wasn't the angry, guilt-ridden teenager Marcus remembered. This was a man who looked happy, genuinely happy, with his arm around the woman he loved. Marcus turned the photo over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Carlos and Isabella, Guatemala City, 2014. For our daughters, so they know they were made from love. The letter was in Spanish, addressed to Maria Gonzalez. Marcus's Spanish was rusty, but he could make out enough to understand that it was Isabella explaining the girls' situation and begging Maria to care for them. But there was more, a section that made Marcus's blood run cold. Isabella had written that Carlos had told her about his family in New York, about a younger brother named Marcus, who had rebuilt what their father had destroyed. She mentioned that Carlos had watched from afar as Marcus became successful, proud, but too ashamed of the family's past to ever make contact. He loved his brother, Isabella had written, but believed Marcus was better off without the reminder of their father's sins. Carlos died thinking Marcus had forgotten him completely. Marcus set the letter down with trembling hands. Carlos had been watching him all these years, had known about his success, had been proud of him from a distance. And Marcus had been so busy trying to forget his brother existed that he had never even tried to find him. Now Carlos was dead, and his daughters were sleeping in Marcus's guest room, unaware that they weren't charity cases, but the rightful heirs to half of everything Marcus had built. As he sat in the silence of his study, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Marcus realized that finding Emma and Sophie hadn't been an act of kindness. It had been a reckoning 30 years in the making. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to tell them the truth about who they were and who he was. Tonight, he would have to live with the knowledge that his brother had died believing Marcus had forgotten him, when the truth was that Marcus had worked so hard to forget precisely because he had never stopped missing Carlos at all. The rain had stopped falling outside, but the storm that had been brewing in Marcus Wellington's life for 3 decades was just beginning. Marcus woke before dawn, something that hadn't happened in years without an alarm. The penthouse was silent, except for the soft hum of the climate control system, but his mind was anything but quiet. He had spent most of the night staring at the photograph of Carlos and Isabella, trying to reconcile the happy man in the picture with the guilt-ridden teenager who had fled their family's scandal 3 decades ago. At 6 a.m., he padded quietly to the guest suite to check on the girls. Through the slightly open door, he could see them sleeping peacefully in the king-sized bed, Emma curled protectively around Sophie, even in sleep maintaining her role as guardian. Sophie's breathing was clear and even, the antibiotics already working their magic. Marcus returned to his study and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. He called his lawyer, Jonathan Westbrook, at home. "Marcus, it's barely sunrise. What's wrong?" Jonathan's voice was thick with sleep but alert with concern. "I need you to research something for me immediately," Marcus said without preamble. "A man named Carlos Esteban who died recently in Guatemala. I need to know everything. When, how, what happened to his family, everything." "This is about a business deal?" Marcus hesitated. "It's personal." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. In the 15 years Jonathan had represented Marcus, the word personal had never entered their conversations. "I'll have preliminary information by noon," Jonathan said finally. "Marcus, are you in some kind of trouble?" "No," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just find out everything you can about Carlos Esteban and his family." At 7:30 a.m., Mrs. Chen arrived for her usual morning routine and nearly dropped her keys when she found Marcus in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast for 3 people. In the 5 years she had worked for him, she had never seen him prepare food for anyone, including himself. "Mr. Wellington," Mrs. Chen asked in her accented English, "you have guests?" "2 children," Marcus explained, realizing how inadequate that sounded. "They're staying here temporarily while they recover from illness and we locate their family." Mrs. Chen's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Marcus had ever seen from her. "Children, how wonderful! I make proper breakfast for growing ones, yes? Pancakes, fruit, milk." Marcus nodded gratefully, realizing that Mrs. Chen's grandmother instincts were far better suited to this situation than his complete lack of experience with children. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8 a.m., dressed in the same clothes from yesterday, but having made an attempt to clean herself up in the suite's bathroom. She moved cautiously, clearly overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her, but trying not to show it. "Sophie is still sleeping," Emma reported to Marcus. Her fever is gone, and she's breathing much better." "That's good news," Marcus replied, then found himself at a loss for what to say next. How did one make conversation with an 8-year-old? Especially one who was unknowingly his niece. Mrs. Chen saved him from the awkward silence by sweeping Emma into the breakfast preparation process, chattering in a mixture of English and Mandarin while showing her how to properly flip pancakes. Emma absorbed everything with the quick intelligence Marcus was beginning to recognize as a family trait. "Mrs. Chen," Emma said as she carefully turned a pancake, "are you Mr. Wellington's grandmother?" Mrs. Chen laughed, a rich sound that filled the usually sterile kitchen with warmth. "No, little one. I am his housekeeper. But I think maybe he needs grandmother figure, yes? He works too much, never has family visit." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Mrs. Chen is true," she said, waving a spatula at him. "5 years I work here, never see him smile genuine way until today. These children are good for you, Mr. Wellington." When Sophie emerged an hour later, still pale but clearly feeling better, the kitchen had been transformed into something resembling a normal family breakfast scene. Emma was teaching Mrs. Chen Spanish words for cooking ingredients, while Sophie shyly accepted a glass of fresh orange juice. "This is the best food I've had in weeks," Sophie said quietly, her voice still hoarse but stronger than the day before. The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. These children had been hungry, truly hungry, while he lived in a palace and worried about which of his cars to drive to work. "Girls," Marcus said, setting down his coffee cup, "I need to ask you some questions about your father, about Carlos Esteban." Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What kind of questions?" "Did your mother ever tell you anything specific about his family in America? Any names, places? Anything that might help us understand more about your background?" Emma exchanged a glance with Sophie before answering. "Mama said Carlos's family was very rich, but that something bad happened with his father. She said Carlos left to protect everyone from shame, but that he always hoped someday his family would forgive him." "Forgive him for what?" "For being related to someone who did bad things with money," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "Mama said it wasn't Carlos's fault, but that sometimes innocent people suffer for what guilty people do." Marcus felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. Even from thousands of miles away, even through the filter of a grieving mother's explanation to young children, the truth of their family's past had traveled intact. His phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. "Preliminary research complete. Carlos Esteban died 3 months ago from complications of dengue fever in Guatemala City. Survived by wife Isabella, deceased 2 weeks ago, cause unknown, and twin daughters Emma and Sophie, age 8. Stop by my office when you can. 3 months ago. Carlos had been alive just 3 months ago, while Marcus was closing deals and building his empire, completely unaware that his brother was dying in a hospital thousands of miles away." "Mr. Wellington?" Emma's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you okay? You look very sad." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just Carlos's eyes but their mother's gentle spirit and their grandfather's stubborn chin. This child was a living piece of the family Marcus had convinced himself was gone forever. "Emma," he said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that I might have known your father?" Both girls went very still. Sophie set down her orange juice with trembling hands. "How could you have known our papa?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus took a deep breath. "Because Carlos Esteban was my brother." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Mrs. Chen gasped and pressed her hand to her heart. Emma's eyes went wide, searching Marcus's face for any sign of deception. Sophie began to cry, though whether from joy or confusion wasn't clear. "That's impossible," Emma said finally. "Our papa's brother was named Marcus Wellington, and Mama said he was a very important businessman who forgot about his family." "I am Marcus Wellington," Marcus said quietly, "and I didn't forget about Carlos. I tried to forget because it hurt too much to remember." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "You're lying. Our papa said his brother became cold and mean, that he cared more about money than people. You can't be him because you helped us." The accusation stung because it contained so much truth. Marcus had become cold and mean, had cared more about money than people. The fact that he had helped them was an aberration, not evidence of his character. "I am exactly the person your father described," Marcus said, his voice heavy with years of regret. "But finding you and Sophie yesterday, it changed something in me. It made me remember who I used to be before I built walls around my heart." Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "If you're really our papa's brother, then you're our uncle," Marcus finished. "I'm your Uncle Marcus." The word felt foreign on his tongue, weighted with responsibilities and emotions he had no experience handling. Emma shook her head, backing toward the door. "This is too much. Yesterday we were homeless and hungry. Today we're living in a palace with an uncle we didn't know existed. It feels like a dream that might disappear." "It's not a dream," Marcus said, standing slowly so as not to frighten her further. "And I promise you, it won't disappear. Your family, Emma. You and Sophie are the only family I have left." "But why didn't you look for our papa?" Emma demanded, tears streaming down her face. "If you loved him, why didn't you try to find him?" The question Marcus had been dreading came from the lips of an 8-year-old who deserved an answer he wasn't sure he could give. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I was hurt and angry, and I convinced myself it was easier to pretend Carlos didn't exist than to deal with the pain of losing him. I was wrong, Emma. I was wrong about everything." "Mrs." Chen moved quietly around the table and put her arms around both girls, her grandmother instincts kicking in as the emotional weight of the revelation settled over them. "Children need time to understand big news," she said softly. "Mr. Wellington, maybe you explain more slowly, yes? Too much too fast makes hearts confused." Marcus nodded, realizing that his confession, while necessary, had just shattered whatever small sense of security the girls had begun to feel. He had given them the truth, but truth without context was often more destructive than helpful. His phone rang, interrupting the tense silence. The caller ID showed Jonathan's office number. "I have to take this," Marcus said apologetically. "Mrs. Chen, could you—" "I stay with girls," she confirmed, already guiding Emma and Sophie toward the living room. "You handle business, we handle hearts." As Marcus answered the call, he couldn't help but think that Mrs. Chen had just summarized the fundamental problem with his entire approach to life. "Marcus, you need to get down here immediately." Jonathan's voice was tight with urgency. "The information about Carlos Esteban has some complications that we need to discuss in person." Marcus glanced toward the living room where Mrs. B. Chen was showing the girls his collection of art books, pointing out paintings from around the world. For the first time in his adult life, he felt torn between business obligations and personal responsibilities. "Can't you brief me over the phone?" "Not this time. Trust me, Marcus. You need to see these documents." An hour later, Marcus sat in Jonathan's downtown office, staring at a manila folder that contained more information about his brother's life than he had accumulated in 30 years of willful ignorance. "Carlos Esteban established quite a life for himself in Guatemala," Jonathan began, pulling out official documents. "He became a respected civil engineer, working on infrastructure projects for rural communities. By all accounts, he was well regarded and successful in his own right." "That's good," Marcus said, though he sensed this wasn't the complicated part. "Here's where it gets interesting," Jonathan continued, producing a legal document. 3 years ago, Carlos hired a lawyer in Guatemala City to research his family's financial situation in the United States. Specifically, he wanted to know about the status of the Wellington estate and your business holdings. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Why would he do that? According to his lawyer's notes, Carlos discovered that your father's conviction was posthumously overturned. New evidence emerged, proving that Richard Wellington was framed by his business partner, who had been embezzling the pension funds and needed a scapegoat. Your father died an innocent man, Marcus. The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Everything he had believed about his family's disgrace, everything Carlos had run away from, had been built on a lie. "When was this overturned?" Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. 2 years ago. The real embezzler, David Hoffman, confessed on his deathbed. The families who lost their pensions received full restitution from Hoffman's estate, and your father's name was officially cleared. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair. Carlos knew about this. His lawyer's final report, is dated 6 months ago. Carlos definitely knew your father was innocent before he died. Jonathan pulled out another document. But here's the most complicated part. According to Guatemala's inheritance laws and the original terms of your grandfather's will, Carlos's daughters are entitled to a substantial portion of the Wellington estate. Your grandfather's will specified that Richard's children and their descendants would inherit equally. How substantial? Roughly 40% of your current net worth. We're talking about approximately $300 million, Marcus. The number hung in the air between them like an unexploded bomb. Marcus had built his empire on the foundation his grandfather had left, but he had never considered that Carlos might have legal claim to half of that foundation. There's more, Jonathan said grimly. The girl's aunt, Maria Gonzalez, isn't just missing. She's dead, died in a car accident 4 months ago, which is why the girls couldn't find her. But before she died, Maria had been in contact with Carlos about the inheritance situation. Marcus felt the walls of his carefully ordered world crumbling around him. What kind of contact? Maria was a paralegal who had been researching the family's legal options. She and Carlos were planning to contact you formally to discuss the inheritance rights and possibly arrange a reunion. The letters we found suggest Carlos was ready to put the past behind him and reconnect with his family. He was going to contact me. The correspondence indicates he was waiting for the right moment, wanting to approach you from a position of strength rather than need. He wanted to prove he had built a respectable life before reaching out. Marcus stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline, seeing it with different eyes. Everything he had achieved, everything he had built in the name of restoring the Wellington reputation, had been constructed on a foundation of lies and misunderstanding. Jonathan, he said slowly, legally speaking, what are my obligations to Emma and Sophie? If you acknowledge them as Carlos's daughters, and therefore your nieces, you become their legal guardian by default, given the absence of other family. You would also be obligated to manage their inheritance until they reach majority. And if I don't acknowledge them? Jonathan's expression grew stern. Marcus, I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you even consider taking advantage of children. Don't start now. I'm not considering taking advantage of them, Marcus said sharply. I'm trying to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with. The full scope is this. You have 2 nieces who have lost everything, who are entitled to a fortune they don't even know exists, and who are currently depending on you for their basic survival. The legal complications are secondary to the human ones. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Girls asking when Uncle Marcus coming home. Sophie drew picture for you. The word home in Mrs. Chen's message hit him unexpectedly hard. When had his sterile penthouse become home to anyone other than himself? I need copies of everything, Marcus told Jonathan, and I need you to prepare guardianship papers. You're sure about this? Marcus thought about Emma's fierce protectiveness of her sister, about Sophie's shy trust, about the photograph of his brother looking genuinely happy for the first time in Marcus's memory. Their family, he said simply, whatever complications that brings, we'll figure it out. On the drive back to Wellington Tower, Marcus called Dr. Stevens to check on Sophie's recovery progress. She's responding beautifully to the antibiotics, Dr. Stevens reported. As long as she stays in a stable environment and finishes the medication course, she should be completely recovered within the week. How are you managing the adjustment to having children in your home? It's educational, Marcus admitted. Dr. Stevens laughed. They always are. Mr. Wellington, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but those girls have been through significant trauma. Finding stable family support could be life-changing for them. Dr. Stevens, what would you say if I told you they weren't just random children I decided to help? I'd say that would explain why you've approached this situation with more commitment than most people show toward their own relatives. When Marcus returned to the penthouse, he found Emma and Sophie in his study, carefully examining the books on his shelves. Emma was reading titles aloud to Sophie, translating the English ones into Spanish. Uncle Marcus, Sophie ran to him, holding up a crayon drawing. I made you a picture. The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a tall building. One large figure wore a suit and had grey scribbles for hair. 2 smaller figures with brown scribbles for hair stood on either side, holding the large figure's hands. "This is our family," Sophie explained proudly. "You and me and Emma." Marcus knelt down to Sophie's level, studying the drawing with the intensity he usually reserved for multi-million-dollar contracts. "It's beautiful, Sophie. Thank you." Emma approached more cautiously. "Mrs. Chen said you had to go to work because of something about our papa." Marcus looked at both girls, these children who had lost everything and were now looking to him with cautious hope in their eyes. He thought about the inheritance they didn't know about the father they would never see again, about the choices that had led them all to this moment. "Girls, I need to tell you some things about your father and our family. Some of it is sad, but some of it might make you proud of who you are." They settled on the leather couch in his study. Sophie curled against Emma's side, while Emma maintained her protective vigilance. Marcus told them about their grandfather's innocence, about how Carlos had spent years believing he was running from a shameful legacy that had never been real. "Papa wasn't ashamed of anything bad?" Emma asked. "Your father was a good man who thought he was protecting everyone by staying away," Marcus explained. "He didn't know that the shame he was carrying wasn't his to carry. But he's gone now," Sophie said sadly, "so he never got to know the truth made things okay." Marcus felt tears threaten for the first time in decades. "No, sweetheart. He never got to know that everything was okay." "Will you tell us stories about him?" Emma asked. "About when you were boys together." And so Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done in 30 years. Remembering Carlos, not as the guilty teenager who had abandoned him, but as the older brother who had taught him to ride a bike, who had defended him from school bullies, who had been his best friend until the world fell apart around them. As the afternoon wore on, with Sophie falling asleep against his shoulder, and Emma listening with rapt attention to stories of their father's childhood, Marcus realized that the walls he had built around his heart weren't just crumbling, they were being demolished by two little girls who had inherited their father's capacity for love, despite inheriting his losses. But even as he embraced this new reality, Marcus knew the most difficult conversation was yet to come. Eventually, he would have to tell Emma and Sophie that they weren't just family, they were heirs to a fortune that would change their lives forever. Tonight, though, he would simply be Uncle Marcus, telling stories about a brother he had missed every day for 30 years, but had been too proud and too afraid to admit it. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in his study, watching Emma help Sophie with her English homework at the antique writing desk that had once belonged to their great-grandfather. The sight still caught him off guard. How naturally they had settled into his life, how completely they had transformed his cold penthouse into something resembling a home. Sophie had recovered fully from her pneumonia, her laughter now echoing through rooms that had been silent for years. Emma had gradually relaxed her protective stance as she began to trust that this new stability wasn't temporary. Both girls attended a prestigious private school just 6 blocks away, where their intelligence and resilience had quickly earned them academic recognition and friends. Mrs. Chen had become their unofficial grandmother, teaching them Mandarin phrases, while they taught her Spanish cooking techniques. The kitchen that had once been Marcus's least used room now buzzed with activity every morning and evening. But despite the domestic tranquility, Marcus carried the weight of the secret about their inheritance like a physical burden. Jonathan had prepared all the legal documents, but Marcus hadn't found the courage to explain to 2 8-year-olds that they were worth $300 million. "Uncle Marcus," Emma said, looking up from her homework, "Mrs. Chen says you've been sad lately. Are you tired of taking care of us?" The question pierced him. "Never, Emma. Taking care of you and Sophie has been. It's been the best thing I've ever done." "Then why do you look worried all the time?" Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. Jonathan's name appeared on the caller ID, and Marcus stepped onto his private terrace to take the call. "Marcus, we have a problem," Jonathan said without preamble. "The Guatemalan government has been looking for Emma and Sophie. Apparently their visa situation is complicated, and Child Services here has been notified. We need to resolve their legal status immediately." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to formalize their guardianship and residency status, which requires full disclosure of their inheritance and your relationship to them." "No more keeping secrets, Marcus. The authorities need complete transparency." How much time do we have? The hearing is scheduled for next Friday, 1 week. Marcus ended the call and stood on the terrace, looking out at Central Park, where early winter snow was beginning to fall. 7 days to prepare 2 children for the truth about their father, their family, and their future. He found Emma and Sophie in the living room, building an elaborate castle out of the expensive art books he had never read. They looked up at him with the easy trust they had developed over the past 3 weeks. "Girls, we need to have a very important conversation." Something in his tone made Emma straighten, her protective instincts immediately alert. "Are we in trouble?" "No, but there are some things about your situation, about our family, that I need to explain before other people start asking you questions." Marcus sat down on the floor beside their book castle, abandoning the formal distance he had maintained his entire adult life. "Do you remember when I told you about your grandfather, about how he was innocent of the crimes he was accused of?" Both girls nodded. "Well, your grandfather left something behind when he died. Something that belonged to your father, and now belongs to you." "What kind of something?" Sophie asked. Marcus took a deep breath. "Money. A lot of money. Enough money that you'll never have to worry about having a place to live or food to eat or anything else you might need." Emma's eyes narrowed. "How much money?" "Enough that when you grow up you could buy anything you wanted. Houses, cars, you could travel anywhere in the world. You could start your own businesses or help other people start theirs." "Are we rich like you?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "Richer," Marcus said quietly. "Much richer." Emma stood up abruptly, scattering art books across the marble floor. "This is why you're really taking care of us, isn't it? Because we have money that belongs to you." "Emma, no. You didn't help us because we're family," she continued, her voice rising with hurt and anger. "You helped us because we're valuable." "That's not true," Marcus said, rising to follow her as she backed toward the window. "I didn't know about the inheritance when I found you in the rain. I helped you because something in my heart recognized you before my mind understood who you were." "Prove it," Emma demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Prove you care about us and not our money." Marcus looked at this fierce, protective little girl who had inherited not just her father's eyes, but his integrity, and realized there was only one way to prove his love wasn't conditional on their financial value. "Jonathan," he called his lawyer immediately, putting the phone on speaker so the girls could hear, "I need you to transfer the full inheritance amount to a trust fund that I cannot touch. Emma and Sophie Esteban are to be the sole beneficiaries, with access beginning on their 18th birthdays." "Marcus, that's a significant—" "Do it now, Jonathan. I want legal documents showing that I have no financial claim to their inheritance, and I want those documents ready for the hearing next Friday." Emma stopped crying, studying Marcus's face with the intensity she had inherited from generations of Wellington determination. "But what about you?" Sophie asked, confused. "Won't you need money for your business?" Marcus knelt down to their level. "I have plenty of money for my business, more than I could ever spend. But your inheritance isn't my money, girls. It never was. It's yours because you're Carlos's daughters, and Carlos was my brother, and our family takes care of each other." "Uncle Marcus," Emma said quietly, "are you sure you want to be our family? Even if we're sad sometimes, or if we make mistakes, or if taking care of us makes your life complicated?" The question revealed the depth of her fear, not just fear of losing their newfound security, but fear of being abandoned again by someone they had learned to love. "Emma," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, 3 weeks ago, I thought I was successful because I had money and power and control over everything in my life. But I wasn't successful. I was empty. You and Sophie didn't just bring family into my life, you brought purpose. You made me remember that success isn't about what you accumulate, it's about who you love and who loves you back." Sophie threw her arms around Marcus's neck. "I love you, Uncle Marcus. Even if you didn't have any money at all, I would still want you to be my family." Emma approached more slowly, then surprised Marcus by taking his hand. "Papa used to tell us that family isn't about blood," she said solemnly. "Family is about people who choose to love you even when it's hard. You chose to love us when we were strangers in the rain. That makes you our real family." As Marcus pulled both girls into his arms, he understood that they had given him something worth more than all the money in the world. They had given him the chance to be the man his brother had believed he could become. The court hearing the following Friday was a formality. With Jonathan's meticulous legal work and Dr. Stevens's testimony about the girl's well-being, the judge granted Marcus permanent guardianship and approved the girl's residency status. The inheritance trust was established exactly as Marcus had requested, with him named as trustee but with no personal access to the funds. 6 months later, Marcus Wellington stood in the same spot on Fifth Avenue where he had first seen Emma and Sophie huddled in the rain. But now he wasn't alone. Emma held his left hand, while Sophie held his right, and they were walking to Delacroix Café for their Saturday morning tradition of pancakes and stories about their father. Henri Delacroix had become Uncle Henri to the girls, teaching them French phrases while they taught him Spanish ones. Mrs. Chen had officially become their live-in guardian figure, her own grandchildren in China, now sharing space in her heart with 2 little girls from Guatemala. The penthouse had been redecorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture, with photographs of Carlos and Isabella displayed prominently alongside pictures of the new life they were building together. Marcus had established a scholarship fund in Carlos's name for children from Guatemala who wanted to study engineering in the United States. "Uncle Marcus," Sophie said as they approached the cafe, "do you think Papa knows we found you?" Marcus looked down at his nieces, his daughters in every way that mattered, and thought about the brother who had died believing he was forgotten. "I think he knows, sweetheart, and I think he's proud of the family we've become." As they entered the warm cafe, laughing at Henri's exaggerated French accent and arguing about whether chocolate chips or blueberries made better pancakes, Marcus realized that the young millionario who had seen homeless twins and felt only uncomfortable recognition was gone forever. In his place was a man who had learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, it's the courage to love someone enough to let them change you completely. The rain had stopped falling months ago, but the storm that had brought them together had left behind something beautiful, a family that chose each other, imperfect and complicated and absolutely unbreakable. Emma and Sophie Esteban had found their home, and Marcus Wellington had found his heart. Neither of them would ever be homeless again.